Now more of the Midcoast Morning Buzz with Richard and Jim. Radio 9, WCME.
The clam populations in many mid-coast clam flats, as well as throughout Casco Bay, have been experiencing a very noticeable decline over the past decade, particularly for soft-shell clams, and now the communities are coming together to find out what's going on with that. To that end, there's a meeting tonight at 6 p.m. in the Municipal Room at Brunswick Station and Station Avenue. Two of the people heavily involved in that is Dan Devereaux. He's the Marine Patrol Officer for Brunswick. He will moderate the discussion. And Darci Couture is lead scientist and principal at Brunswick-based Resource Access International, who is being partially funded by the town of Freeport, along with a grant from the Department of Agriculture and Conservation and Forestry to conduct a survey. Thank you both for coming in this morning. Dan, I'd like to start with you. How big is this decline? What's the area and what's the rate of the decline of these clams?
Well, I think you're seeing it all over the coast of Maine, but particularly in southern Maine where the water temperatures are a little bit warmer and we're experiencing a little bit more drastic ocean acidification and some green crab predation in and around this area. You're seeing some decline all over. However, most of it is in the southern portion of the region, I believe.
How many clammers does this affect? Do you know what a monetary figure is on this? These poor people have got to be beside themselves as to all of a sudden that there's nothing there where they dug for years.
I don't know if I would say that there was nothing there. There's a decline, and there's still clams there. The catch is down, and that's one thing that we're concerned about. And we're seeing size classes, the smaller size classes, not in as abundance as they were in the past. Yeah. So that's really our concern is that it's important for, I think, regionally to look at why we're seeing this decline in the smaller classes. Acidification has been studied by Mark Green from St. Joe's College for quite a long time now, and he's pretty much has scientifically proven that it certainly exists. And it certainly affects juvenile clams that are in the water column after they spawn. That's one of our concerns, is trying to bring that acidification level back down in the ocean and how we're going to do that. I think a big part of it is from fossil fuels, and the ocean sucks a certain percentage of that up. And, the scientists would be able to tell you, I'm just a manager, but Darcy's sitting right here, and she probably knows a little bit more about ocean acidification than I do.
Dan pretty much nailed it. I mean, essentially it is CO2 emissions over time that have been sequestered in the ocean. And, we kind of got a little bit of a heads up because on the West Coast they're experiencing extremely severe ocean acidification impacts where their larval shellfish are actually dissolving in the ocean. And their oceanography is a little bit different than ours. They're forced to endure deep ocean water that essentially sucked up carbon 30 or 40 years ago, and now that's rising up and impacting their clam flats. Fortunately, on our East Coast, we don't have upwelling, we have downwelling, so we're a little less affected in that way, but we do have localized impacts affecting us.
Also in the mix is the green crab that's been around here in our waters since the 1800s. And also, Harpswell, a few months ago, put a moratorium briefly on building wharf with the pilings that are pressure treated, and then rescinded that. What's going to be your focus on your study with Freeport?
We're trying to go about both of the major issues, the predation issue as well as trying to mitigate ocean acidification. So we're attempting to use a couple different treatments in the clam flats that have had successes in the past and see which ones of those options are going to work. Mark Green has done a lot of work laying shell hash down to help mitigate the acid level in the mud at that very localized point where the clams settle and survive. The other thing that we're going to be looking at is predator fencing and trapping to see if we can minimize the impacts of the green crabs on the clams that do settle there.
Now, is there any indication that the clams that are currently being harvested are less than healthy?
There have been some signs of neoplasia in the Harpswell area and in some other areas around Maine. It's not completely understood what triggers that. It's essentially like a clam cancer. It's not anything that affects people. There's no human health issue there. It's simply the clams reacting to a suite of stressors that then make them unhealthy. So that's another issue that's out there right now.
And Dan, back to you now. Bloodworm harvesting. Now, the clammers and the bloodwormers coexist, not necessarily amicably, but that's also been a factor that bloodworm harvesting in the clam flats has had an adverse effect on the clam population. Is that true?
To some extent, I believe. Over-harvesting of an area and overturning an area will cause some adverse effects to the juvenile clams that are in the top 4 to 5 inches of sediment. And that's one of the things that the town of Brunswick had noticed back about 2 years ago, that there was an increased number of worm harvesters, marine worm harvesters in our areas. And we had one area that was closed that we conducted a survey on. When I say survey, we conducted an inventory survey where we go out and actually do try to come up with a harvestable amount of clams that are in the entire flat. And when it was closed for 2 years, on a pollution closure, we got it back open. However, it had been hit really heavy with worm harvesting, repetitive worm harvesting. They go back over the flat and over the flat and over the flat. And what we noticed was a drastic decline in those smaller size classes. So, anecdotally, I think that we believe that over-harvesting of an area will cause decline in our smaller size classes.
Darcie, what's going to be your time window on the survey? Now, you're doing it specifically for the town of Freeport,
Yeah,
correct?
It's for the town of Freeport, and it's going to go on from April through November, all of the field work, and then we'll compile all the data, run some statistics, assess the results at that point, and submit a report to the town in December. And we're hoping that maybe what happens in Freeport is something that can be utilized by the other surrounding communities to pick and choose things that seem to work well and maybe have them start to use some of those strategies.
Are you looking for a definitive answer?
You know, the problem is this is such a, if we had a vibrant clam population, it could withstand any one of these stressors and do all right. But we, Dan was mentioning before, we kind of have a perfect storm right now of all these conditions that are bad for the mud and bad for clams, and they're larger issues than we can actually control. So the answer is going to be, how do you minimize the impacts at that local level? That's what we're trying to work on.
Dan, finally, what are the unique problems that it presents to you as a Marine Patrol officer? And what is it that the clammers and everybody else can do as good stewards of the clam flats to help this out in the interim?
Well, I think we all play our own part, with the shoreline zoning and trying to control runoff, different parts like that, trying to educate landowners about nitrates that they put on their lawns to make them nice and green. Sometimes that's not the best option. The problems that it presents to me is that now we need to learn how to manage around it. I don't know how much impact we can have locally, and that's why we're having this regional meeting, is to talk more about a regional collaboration on different types of zoning issues, different types of environmental projects, different types of propagation projects, and that's one of the keys of this, I think, to managing around climate change and the rest of the problems that's happening, the green crab predation.
The open meeting is tonight at 6 o'clock at the Municipal Room at Brunswick Station on Station Avenue. Our guests today have been Darci Couture, who's a scientist with Resource Access International, and Dan Devereaux. Dan's the Brunswick Marine Patrol Officer. Thank you both for coming in this morning, and we'll keep you updated.
Thank you.